Everybody, I think we should get started. We have quite a complex topic to tackle in the next before 10:30. To introduce myself, I'm Debi O'Donovan. I'm director of the Reward and Employee Benefits Association, which is based in the UK. And I've got a very fine panel here, which I'll be introducing in a few moments. But what we're hoping to do in the next 55 or so minutes is look at executive remuneration, the option for actions investors can take to engage more to help make remuneration work more effectively across different markets, and also try, if we can, to give you a bit of a view, a bit of an insight into what might be next, what's coming down the line for executive remuneration. Now, to help me do that, I've got three fantastic experts who really know their stuff. And bear that in mind as you think of questions. We're hoping to leave a good 20 minutes if we're lucky, but we've got a lot to get through at the end for questions from the audience. So on my left, so your right, we have Corinne Carr. Corinne is an independent remuneration governance professional, and she implements financial services regulations both in the UK and here in Europe. But most relevant for our discussions today, Corinne is working closely with PRI to promote their principles and looking at how investing in ESG pays financially. So she'll be touching on that quite a bit during the session. Next to her in the middle of the panel is Euan Stirling. He's head of Stewardship and ESG investment at Standard Life. He started his career as an accountant, which I'm sure many of you in your audience did, before becoming a fund manager and investment analyst. But his current role brings together governance and stewardship and responsible investment teams with a reporting line into the Chief Investment Officer at Standard Life. And then next to me is somebody I think many of you will know already, and I had the delight of meeting this morning, Christian Strenger. He has such a long list of honours and job titles, I thought it would take up the whole session. So, okay, taking note of that, I will introduce you quite simply as being a supervisory board member at Deutsche Asset Management.
Okay.
So, I'm going to address my first question to you. And it sounds like a simple question, but actually, like many simple questions, it's more complex. What's working well with executive pay, and what isn't?
Well, thank you, Debbie, and good morning to all of you. It's a pleasure to be here in our capital. What's working well? Not so much, because in Germany alone we had 10 AGM votes this year on remuneration systems and packages, 10 DAX companies, and 3 of them got voted down. Right? That also has an interesting aside. Then German companies say, well, we're not pleased, but we'll try again. Whilst in the UK, I always note with pleasure that then the Remco chairman disappears, which I think is a much better way of enforcement. Anyway, so what is perhaps not working is particularly that it's all become much too complicated. We need simplification. Very clearly, because this is not only good for the executives, that they know what they should be incentivized for, but also for the investors and stakeholders. And it's a big part of what we want to really move, not only with this conference, which is drive ESG better. And that means governance in particular, but also full respect for E and S matters. And there, I think we can do a lot better, particularly in the long-term variable pay, which we should, however, as I said, simplification, structure in a way that everybody of the stakeholders and the executives can really understand what this is all good for. We have many negative examples. I think the one that hasn't been mentioned, perhaps because it's further away, is Wells Fargo, where the phony account scandal caused long-term reputation issues. And nevertheless, these 2 particular people in charge of all these matters got 3-digit million farewell payments out of their long-term incentive pay structure, which is certainly all wrong, and there's been some effort to claw back, but not very successful. And again, reputation is hurt for a long time. The other one in this country here is Volkswagen, where you have long-term bonus arrangements which reflect only the past. So that's why, despite a loss of over 4 billion euros in 2015, the management board members got 35 million euros without shame. And the wonderful man who was the minister president of Lower Saxony even defended this, that they had contributed to the sort of making up of the scandal. Interesting. So I think we need to really get further down the line and simplify, and particularly also on the ESG, in the long-term incentive, do things that are not more of the same, but very clearly tailored to the needs and the environment of the individual company. And that's where the Remuneration Committee is particularly sort of is charged to do this in an appropriate, but again, understandable fashion. And that's what sort of I think is first and foremost. So, and perhaps also to put in another wedge for simplification, the past CFO of SAP has made the proposal that management board members, or what you call executive board members, shouldn't get any more pension pay and not any other benefits, because they get so much already. And that is good for simplification as well. So, okay.
Thank you very much. So, interesting points there. Euan, what's your view? Why is executive pay broken?
Interesting question, particularly from a UK context. I'm going to be doubly loud because I get two microphones. In the UK, the politicians have been getting very involved in executive pay. And I think that tells you something. If you look at recent events, very recently, last weekend in Germany, the rise of the far right, just working our way back, the election of Donald Trump in the US and the Brexit vote in the UK. Now, in my financial services circles, I don't know many people that support these moves, but there's clearly something underlying in society's view of the status quo, and there's something there about inequality, and the ruling classes are being rebelled against now, and I think a lot of the blame is being put at the rise of executive pay over and above mainstream pay. So I think that politicians only get involved when they feel that there's something, an issue to be dealt with. And executive pay seems to me to be the lightning rod through which many societal complaints about the way businesses are run are actually expressed. And you only need to look at a chart of how executive pay has risen over the last 20 years versus mainstream pay to see why that is the case. One of the good things, one of the things that acts in the favour of investors as either asset owners or asset managers is the way that disclosure has improved. And I think there's going to be a constant pressure for that to continue. Now, whether that comes in the way of single-figure pay, as we have in many countries, or particular ratios, as are being introduced in other countries, the disclosure is being met with equal amounts of outrage, in my view, and it's important that companies deal with that. So I think remuneration is broken as it stands, particularly because quantum of executive pay has got out of line with quantum of mainstream pay, and I don't think you can ignore that anymore, and that has to be addressed, and we have responsibilities as investors to do that. We can and should be held to account, so we need to take that responsibility seriously, and be part of the chain of command that improves the situation.
So given we've got that misalignment, this is a perfect time to bring Corinne in. So what does responsible exec pay look like, Corinne?
Thank you, Debi, and thank you to the UNPRI for inviting me here today. What I would like to talk about this morning is three things. I'd like to introduce you to the concept of responsible reward. I will also tell you a little bit about a survey that we ran in the summer on that very topic. And lastly, I will give you the position of the UNPRI on responsible reward. So, responsible reward. These are two words that we would not necessarily associate with executive pay for the reasons that we just heard. Responsible reward is an emerging trend of paying people, starting with executives, but also going down the layers of management and, in fact, the whole workforce by integrating ESG factors in pay structures. So there are a few examples around of corporations who have done that. Unfortunately, not so many examples of financial institutions. And this is the reason why we are raising awareness on that topic. So we are moving away, or we are considering an alternative way of paying executives, managers, and in fact, as I said, the whole workforce, from the standard model of base pay, short-term incentives and long-term incentives, by bringing in ESG metrics into the mix. So I mentioned a survey that we run very, over the summer of this concept of responsible reward. So this survey constituted of 10 questions, and one of the questions, in fact, we will be asking you today. So we will ask you for a show of hands, and before I tell you about the results of the survey, then this is the question. So how effective are executive pay structures at supporting business strategy? So you've got 4 choices, and we'll ask you for a show of hands if you don't mind. Are they very effective, somewhat effective, ineffective, or detrimental? So if you'd like to raise your hand if you think they are very effective at supporting business strategy, then please do so. Okay. Then we're going down to somewhat effective.
Okay.
Thank you. Ineffective?
It's probably about 4 hands, 5, 6 hands there.
Yes, so the majority so far was on somewhat effective. What about detrimental? So we've got a few.
2 hands, yeah.
Okay. That's really interesting findings. This question, as I said, with a number of short, the rest of the survey, was asked to a mixed population of both investors and reward professionals. And the reward function, just to remind you, and we used reward and remuneration interchangeably, so please bear with me if we use those two words. The reward function sits under the human resources function in a corporate, in an organization. And the purpose of what we do as a profession is to design how and how much the people are paid. So when we asked that question to reward professionals and investors, we got very different results. In fact, the reward professionals, HR and reward professionals, thought, interestingly, just like you, that the results would be between very effective and somewhat effective. So they were very buoyant, very engaged, and thought that the structures that they're designing are supporting the business strategy. When we asked the same question to investors, we were right at the bottom end, so between ineffective and detrimental. So what that illustrates is that there is a clear disconnect when we're asking that question to two different populations and getting to very different answers. So what I mentioned as well is that the UNPRI have got some guidance on executive pay and how to integrate ESG factors into those structures. As signatories to the principles, I'm sure you are aware of the 6 overarching principles that the UNPRI asks you to sign up to when you become a signatory. what you may not be aware of is that the UNPRI has carried out some research, and in fact it's not, it started in 2012 with a revised paper in 2016 on how to integrate ESG issues into executive pay. So the latest study was very much aimed at the global utility and extractive companies. However, the recommendations do apply to, can be applied to all industries. What's important to bear in mind from the UNPRI's point of view is that these guidelines should apply to the companies you're investing in, and I will tell you what they are in a minute. I'd like you to bear in mind that it's very difficult to ask a company to behave in a certain way if your own company, as an investing company, is not following the same principles. So I will read out to you the three recommendations that the UNPRI has put together for its signatories. So integrating ESG issues into executive pay. The first one is identifying appropriate ESG metrics. The second one is linking ESG metrics to executive pay, and there are pointers. And the third one is disclose company practices. So disclose what's been achieved, what challenges have been encountered, and what results have been achieved. Not, many signatories that I've spoken to, certainly over the last couple of days, are aware of this guidance. So I'm raising your awareness that as a signatory, these are recommendations, these are not compulsory. However, by being a signatory, I'm making you aware that the UNPRI has got a point of view on how to integrate ESG issues into executive pay.
Thank you. So useful insight to hear what PRI is doing. Picking up on the point that there are different people involved with forming remuneration and reward, Christian, where do investors start? Who do they engage with at companies? Because it varies by country to country of who you can engage with.
Yeah, we have a clear line in Germany, and we've last year introduced with some success a line that investors have the right, not only the right, but should be heard by the Supervisory Board chairman, because the Supervisory Board is their elected representative. But it should be concentrated on the Supervisory Board chairman, who is mostly also the REMCO chairperson. So that's where it should be addressed. We have quite some difficulty in what you have perhaps in the stewardship rules of the UK, that all directors, all non-executive directors should be available for discussion with investors. I think that is a difficult proposition because there could be different speaking. I think there's nothing wrong that investors address their concerns to all non-executive board members, particularly the ones that are in charge of setting remuneration, but I think there must be concentration. And definitely you can't do it because we have the dual system, supervisory board to control and do these things, and you have the management board. There's no good running to the management board members, the CEO, and say, you are overpaid. That doesn't sort of work. You can tell him so many ways by voting and that he's getting too much, but the person to be addressed is the chairman of the supervisory board, or in the one-tier system would be the chair of the remuneration committee together with the chairman of the board. That would be my solution for this.
Euan, can you bring your perspective to that question?
Yeah, and my perspective is largely UK based, and I would agree with Christian that it is usually the chairman of the remuneration committee. And what we seek to do when we engage with them is to empower them, to make them think more laterally about what the company's strategy is, to ask them to take responsibility for aligning remuneration with the strategy. Now, I can't imagine for a second that many non-executive directors are going to say, well, here is our strategy, this is how we believe that we're going to succeed, but only have a 3 or a 6 month time frame. And one of the issues, I think, about aligning ESG metrics with a company's strategy is that a lot of people think, well, there's the financial modelling and then there's the ESG factors on the other side. And for us, ESG factors are financial. And I think we need to try to reach a stage where the line between what are viewed as traditional financial analysis factors and ESG factors become blurred to the point that they are just obliterated. So that's the challenge that we lay down to the remuneration committees of the companies. The other thing is, and this is as a result of bitter experience, we also insist that the remuneration committees act in the interests of shareholders rather than in the interests of executives. Now, the vast majority do, but we have a number of repeat offenders, and not just in the UK, where we need to tackle them again and again and again. And when I spoke earlier about remuneration being the lightning rod for societal concerns about big business, I think it's also a lightning rod for our concerns about a way that a company is being run, because what we usually find is when the remuneration is poorly formed, poorly executed and delivering the wrong results for asset owners and asset managers, it's usually indicative of a failure in other aspects of governance.
And that's a really interesting point, that disconnect that you're talking about. But there's also another disconnect in terms of what happens internally. Corinne, can you tell us more about that?
Yes, so I can actually share the internal view because I've experienced it many times myself. So absolutely, the engagement with the chair of the remuneration committee is a must. The chair is there to represent shareholders and to explain why the proposals have been made in a certain way. My experience is when investors have questions about remuneration proposals, they go back to the chair, and make no mistake, it's not the chair that's actually answering the questions, it's people further down the line who will come up with the answers and bring that up to the chair. So what I am suggesting, and I have put it in practice and it does work, is that you start engaging with people further down the chain. So I've actually mentioned the disconnect between the HR reward profession and the investor population. I think these two populations should be talking to each other, and I'm having the same conversation I'm having with you today when I addressed reward conferences, which is that these people, the reward professionals, should reach out to their contact at the investing company by name, make it a personal connection so that year on year you follow the story, you understand the proposals, and if you've got technical questions, you go back to the people who are actually designing the structures. So I would, certainly do not lose the contact to the REMCO chair, but remember the questions are being answered and designed by people further down the chain. And as a combined function, not just HR and reward, but no, it's very much a combined response from investor relations, compliance, risk, finance. Everybody has a say in those decisions. So please engage further down the chain.
Euan, you've got a view on that?
Yeah, I do. And very often when we're involved in remuneration consultations, we do meet with the chair of the remuneration committee, the head of reward, and often they are externally appointed consultant. And the difficulty that we have that I pointed out earlier, where the committee works in the interests of the executives rather than shareholders, we find it is more apparent the further down the chain of command that you go. So if you think about it, the head of reward will probably have a direct line into the chief executive, who will decide whether they live or die in a corporate sense and will decide on their own remuneration. So we find that often that the only point of independence is the chair of the remuneration committee rather than the HR professionals. But I do understand what you mean. The HR professionals tend to understand the ins and the outs, the intricacies of the plans, which is why we need simplicity rather than complexity, so that everybody can understand exactly what people are being paid for, what they're being asked to do.
Are we allowed to have different views?
I would love you to have different views.
I'm slightly skeptical about starting at all these various people you mentioned I would always start at the chairman of the board and the Remco and say that you expect that all these people you mentioned are involved. But I wouldn't sort of go to the investor relations person and say, I think that your boss is totally overpaid or your structure is wrong. What should this poor person say? And you have this danger that investor relations people give their own views, and then they are either dismissed or sort of moved up in the firm. So, concentrated effort, and tell the chairpersons what you expect from them, and that all these relevant people are involved, but not attack them or sort of involve them individually aside from the chairman.
Any comments on that, Corinne?
Yes, I'm not suggesting that one replaces the other. I'm just saying that practically and pragmatically, what happens is that when a corporation receives answers from their investors, the alternatives are being looked at by people who are actually on the ground working out the options. So by all means, the engagement for time reasons and simplicity can be made at the chairman and the Remco chair level. However, do not forget that your teams can engage directly with the teams, the internal teams of the corporation you're investing in.
Yeah, I think this direct engagement has their potential problems, but okay, different from country to country perhaps. I would rather say investors should make themselves clear what they expect and what their views are en detail. Yeah, and if ESG as such an important piece in the whole issue, not only now but in the future, I think it is their duty to say what they think is right and what is good for the company and what needs to be changed. Speak up and say loud and clear, and you can write it down so everybody would get it, and then the internal machine works. Working on supervisory boards, I know if the media sort of comes across and says this is unwarranted, we have a nice discussion, but we do this internally and not to the media.
Okay.
Yeah, the other thing I would point out from an asset management perspective is all of this engagement is enormously resource intensive. So I mentioned earlier the repeat offenders. It really does become an enormous bugbear to try to set out your parameters, set out your stall to the disparate voices that you're hearing from the other side of the table. It's something that we apply an enormous amount of resource to, and we have done in the last 12 or 18 months, particularly in the UK. We had the original shareholder spring of 2012, largely repeated in 16 in advance of mandatory votes for most large UK companies in 2017. And the amount of resource it drew away from other aspects of ESG management, ESG research into all of the companies that we own was astounding. So it's something that we as asset owners and asset managers need to bear in mind, and drawing firm lines with companies I think is very important. And actually withdrawing from the process in some cases is going to be important, and companies will moan about it. But we have to have a hard line allied with our voting intentions.
So perhaps we can pick up on this debate in the question time hopefully in about the next 5-10 minutes, if anybody wants to flesh that out in more detail. But I've got one more question for the panel that I'd like to tackle before open questions to the audience, and that is to look at what the next steps are that you think we need to put in place to make executive remuneration more effective. And perhaps if I can have a relatively quick answer from Christian to start with, and then Euan. Yeah,
Again, simplify it, make it retrievable what sort of the individual points of pay are. And just to perhaps introduce a topic that's not been dealt with yet, sort of the relative cap or multiples this idea, where I think this is going into the wrong direction by saying, and you had it in the US and other countries, the multiple of the shop floor worker. I think you should compare apples with apples, and that means compare top management with the next management layer or the next two management layers, and compare with what other managers get without undue reliance, because this peer pressure is one of the bad things that we are also experiencing too often, and too much sort of, oh yeah, our consultants have said you have to pay so much, otherwise you will lose the good people. These things I think we should do away with.
Yeah, mine would be a little bit of advice for investors, but also for some of the companies that we invest in. I think we need to be clear and consistent. But even in that environment at the moment, companies will always complain that there is no unified investor voice. And what I would encourage companies to do is think about your shareholder register, think about who you give airtime to. If you want a long-term strategy, and if you want to motivate your senior executives through proper long-term incentivization through remuneration, think about who you want on your register, because that will often be reflected in the engagement that you have over remuneration. And I know that some companies do this. Unilever, for example, rarely gives airtime to short-term investors as they see them, focusing their efforts on engaging with long-term investors. And I think that's a model that a lot of companies could follow to make their own lives a lot easier.
Yeah, I completely support what Euan has said. For resources reasons, you need to look at the share register for certainly, the current share register at the time of engagement on remuneration matters, and track that register month on month to see the ins and outs and where you're wanting to deploy your resources. What I would like to talk about as well is to go back to the concept of responsible reward, which is the integration of ESG factors into executive pay. So what we've come up with is a very simple model in 5 steps, which is called EARTH, aptly named for what we're looking at. So EARTH. The E is to evaluate what you are working on currently, where you are, where your positioning is in terms of ESG factors, and whether what the company strategy is and the current position. The A is to ascertain your targets. Where do you want to be? What positioning are you trying to reach? Whether it's on absolute basis or relative basis, where are your aspirations? The R of the EARTH model is about realizing changes. So do you need to appoint different people? Do you need to train up your internal, whether it's your internal staff? Do you need to create an investment committee that is going to specialize in ESG matters? What do you need to do to change your processes and your methods to integrate ESG as part of the investment strategies, and more importantly, or in parallel with remuneration structures? The T of the EARTH model is about telling. There is an awful lot of good things that are being done out there, but people don't know about it. Your internal people may not know about your ESG actions, and certainly there may not be a consensus view from the outside world. So you need to be consistent in your messaging. Tell your people, whether they are internal stakeholders or external stakeholders, as to where you're at, where you want to be, and what progress you've made. And the last pillar of the EARTH model is about help. So that's the H for at the end of EARTH. Help monitor progress. So ESG is not an action that takes place 1 year and is done. We all know that it is an evolutive process, an iterative process, and we need to review the positioning, the ongoing progress, and the results year on year. So if you remember these 5 steps of evaluating, ascertain, realize, telling and helping monitor progress, then this gives you a framework to look at ESG in the context of pay structures.
Thank you, Corinne. So I think you had a question based on that.
I do. So now we're going to, ask you to a question as well, which is that you've listened now to the views of the panels on remuneration structures and this new concept of responsible reward. It is Thursday today. We'll give you, you've got 3 days and get over the weekend. But what I'd like to know is when you go back to the office on Monday, what is the one thing you will be thinking of doing with regards to remuneration structures that based on what you've heard today?
Okay, so we're going to give you, and it is Wednesday. You've got another. You've
Wednesday,
sold us Saturday there.
It is Wednesday, 4 days.
And we'd be very interested to hear what, if you were to go back, whether it's tomorrow, Thursday, or Friday, or Monday, what would you think about doing differently? So while you think about that, I'm just going to throw that same question to Euan to answer, and then come back and see if anybody's got an answer from the audience.
Thank you, Corinne, for that hospital pass, because anything I say will mean that we've been doing it ineffectively up until now. So continuing an evolving trend in the way that we've been dealing with companies is taking that much harder a line each year. I think as the clamour for a re-evaluation of executive pay has risen, I think it has actually emboldened shareholders. And so I've only been in my current role for a short 18 months. And one of the conversations I had with an incoming chair of a remuneration committee was she thanked me for our abstention. Now, when we abstained on the remuneration report, it was designed to send a negative signal to the company. So to be then thanked for doing that told me that the message wasn't getting through. So I would say no more abstentions, unless you have to do it for conflicts of interest purposes. But if you don't like it, vote against it.
Anybody from the audience got a view? I think I can see a hand towards the back. We've got microphones. When you answer the question or make a statement, could you give us your name and where you're from? That's very helpful to know context.
Good morning. I'm Dieter Weitznecker. I'm with the CDW Investment Group in the United States, working with U.S. union pension funds. So what do I want to do different? I think what hasn't really been addressed totally yet, Euan sort of started going in that direction, is how do we actually hold those directors who sit on the remuneration, the compensation committees really accountable? Right, I think what happens if the dialogue doesn't work, if it takes very long, if the voting results really don't show any effect. I mean, in the United States, obviously, I think quantum is totally out of control. There are lots of votes against pay plans. However, they are only recommendations that the board can take on or not, and oftentimes very little is happening. Now, so what's the next step around that?
So who would like to take that question? Euan.
I'll happily answer that, because again, in an evolution of our own process, as well as taking a harder line and reducing the number of abstentions, we are making it personal. So you engage with the company. If you don't get the right result at the next AGM, you then vote against the resolutions. If there will inevitably be engagement around the voting, and then following on from that, if they repeat the offence, make it personal and vote against certainly the chairperson of the remuneration committee, but all of the remuneration committee, hold them all responsible. And then further on from that, there's the chairman of the company if they're not previously involved in the remuneration committee. So I think we do have points of escalation. We also use AGMs as a point of escalation. If we're very dissatisfied with the way that the company is operating, we now habitually will turn up, not at many, I have to say, because it is a point of escalation, but we do show up at AGMs, make statements, and then publicise those statements. So it becomes personal.
I think what we should also, as investors, do is and we already do on particular occasions talk to each other before we go at the chairpersons. And I think this combined approach, without ganging up, but with a combined approach, and I think we should also do this sort of in a variable way, that there's not always the same person talking because the companies speak to themselves all the time. So I think doing it in a joint fashion, and then also on occasion use the media effect. But you have to be careful there not to overdo it, because you also bring the persons on the other side into an adversarial position, and that may sometimes be necessary if it's totally overdone. But if you want to achieve sort of a constructive way forward, and then I think this media weapon should be used very carefully.
Yeah, and I will certainly support these views and give you, well, obviously not named examples, but certainly organisations that I've worked with where the REMCO chair and some of the members of the REMCO committee have not been re-elected for those very reasons. And in fact, again, going back to the internal procedures, the fact that they were not re-elected and there was a change of chair has led to a complete review of the remuneration structures, not just for executives, in fact, but for people further down the chain. So those actions in terms of votes carry an awful lot of weight, and certainly can lead to a review of how and how much people are paid.
Got a question here in the front, then in the fifth row, and then the fourth row. They're queuing up now.
Thank you. I'm John Duncan from Old Mutual Investment Group. I'm kind of curious to hear the panel's thoughts around the broader system of governance in respect of shareholders holding companies to account in regards to executive pay. And I'm thinking in particular of the changes that we've seen in Europe and in Australia, for example, around, this two-strike rule, etc. I mean, is this a positive sort of evolution, and can we expect more of it, given what you mentioned earlier, Euan, in terms of, the increasing politicization, if you like, of executive pay?
Who'd like to take that question? Euan?
I'll happily start, but I would agree with what Christian just pointed out in his last answer. I think collaboration is really important, and it's becoming more and more valuable, because I think like-minded investors are finding a voice with companies. I think they're finding a voice on policy matters in different geographies, and I would expect that to continue. It does feel as if there's a growing strength amongst investors to be more strident with their views, and it's I don't think we can operate in isolation. I think it's a reflection of what we're hearing from our clients, a reflection of what we're hearing from different political moves, that this is absolutely necessary. Things have got out of balance. They need to be rebalanced. This is part of the process, and we need political support to be able to do that properly.
As we are in Berlin, I have to be careful and not say that we shouldn't involve the politicians, but I think they are not ideal partners in this effort to get it straight, because they will listen to their sort of voting public, and there we have experienced that in various things with our German official code, where things were proposed in the code as so-called shell recommendations, which are reportable if you do not accept them. Then the politicians, just before the next federal election, pick up the ones where sort of the ratio of acceptance is low, and then, boom, they come with the next fixed law, which stands there for centuries and is too rigid and not a very good idea. So, yes, I think if you involve the right politicians individually, fine, but sort of general sort of inclusion of the political field, careful.
We've got quite a lot of questions backing up, so let's go straight to the gentleman in the fifth row.
Hugo Euan from Troy Asset Management. I had a question much more fundamentally about the metrics that are used to judge boards or to judge executives on. Clearly we hear about total shareholder return, earnings growth, return on equity as being the traditional financial metrics. And it seems to me there's very little agreement from shareholders on which of those to use and which best incentivizes executives for the long term. ESG metrics on top of that are not easily summed up in one metric like return on equity. So this idea of simplification versus making this more complicated rears its head here. And I'd be interested in the panel's opinions on that, and also on those fundamental metrics of ROE and shareholder growth, and which they would espouse using.
So I had the same question, and I'm just interested in the comment that ESG factors are financial factors, especially, and just exploring that conflict a bit more.
Okay, so who would like to take that? Corinne, would you like to start on that?
Yes, the whole debate about TSR and EPS has been going on for a long time. Then the next debate is whether we go for absolute TSR, relative TSR, and everywhere I go I hear the same debate. So it is a debate, and I'm not sure there is a clear answer to that. In fact, you've got it's a debate for executive pay, and then when you go further down the line again, when we fund managers, they actually quite like TSR. So we're getting into an internal dilemma, which is not easy to answer. I totally get the question around integrating ESG metrics as part of this. Would they be an additional set of metrics, or would they be an overlay, which is a gateway, whereby unless certain ESG objectives had been met, then no variable pay would be payable. And I think the two systems exist, and I don't think there is one size fits all from that point of view. So I don't know if that specifically answers your question, but it doesn't necessarily have to be yet another set of metrics. It can be a way of operating before which variable pay can be determined as part of a risk assessment, for instance.
Hard to really define en detail for each company. It has to be different. Okay, you can take industry-relevant KPIs, and the big question about also this integrated reporting is materiality and connectivity. How you set things up, and then you can really measure them, because ESG matters are not financial. They're extra financial, and that's why sort of putting the right things there and put the reward there. I think Deutsche Telekom some 5 years ago started this already, and they tried, and they gave sort of a piece of the long-term variable pay in good employee relational behavior. But how to measure? Not so easy. You can obviously have some kind of research going, but you're not getting the right answers also by these efforts. So it's sort of very complex and not easy, and that's why the big investors that are always being asked to do things for the remuneration issue, they have a hard time. We can employ, how many people do you have for this only?
Well, we've just doubled it through a merger, so many.
Okay, but you see, it's sort of big extra, and we happily sort of do this because we think this is an alpha opportunity. If we get it right, that's sort of the big point. You see, doing nice things, we know all here. That's sort of not working too well. You will always agree it's better to be nice, but you've got to have a point why you do it, and that's the alpha opportunity, and that's why we happily invest in extra people.
There's a question down here in the front.
Yeah, thank you. It's Johan Vennerluk from NN Investment Partners. If I sort of observe the principal-agent relationship between shareholders and the Remuneration Committee, I cannot help myself but feel that relationship is somewhat broken. So the RemCo is detached from reality in some cases, The question is how we're going to solve it. To what extent is the stewardship code an instrument that we may use in this case? So 2 thoughts from my end. The first one is, should we embed in stewardship codes principles which basically force the REMCO to be held accountable in case there is a number of votes against a changed pay structure? And the second thing is, should we perhaps think about really making the consultation less facultative and more mandatory in terms of when companies need to go to a change of their pay structure, that they need to consult with an X percentage of the shareholder base, and then put that sort of feedback into the remuneration discussion, and then bring that up to the AGM.
Right, who on the panel would like to tackle that? Euan?
Stewardship expert.
I'll give it a try. To be honest, I think that the stewardship codes, the ones that we have looked at and subscribed to, probably give shareholders enough power, but shareholders need to gather that power and use it more effectively. And there's a big missing voice in this, and that's the asset owners. So I think we disconnect from the asset owners at our peril. And it's those gaps, I think, all the way down the chain of command. And it's the chain of performance, it's the chain of alpha. You can leak influence, and I think there's a direct linkage between that and leaking performance. In the company's performance and then its share price performance. When I talked about political support, I wasn't talking about legislation to limit certain ratios. I was just talking about a background of support for shareholders to take on some of the excesses of big business. So it's almost like rather than a sharp stick at your back, it's a helping hand. That I would argue can be more effective. In terms of consultations, they are enormously resource intensive, particularly for the poor performers. And so to insist that investors do more with the companies that are demanding more of their attention, I think can be counterproductive. It's a very strong weapon in our armoury just to say, no, we're not happy, we're going to vote against. If you don't change the proposals that you're putting forward just now, we're not going to accept them. And then, as I say, you have points of escalation. It does become personal. Most of the remuneration committees that we speak to are not, in my experience, divorced from reality. They might be divorced from the groundswell of shareholder opinion, but we will try to empower them to get back on track.
In Germany, we even have paragraph 87 of the company law that requires companies to reduce pay in warranted cases. Although this is sort of maybe a nice sort of thing to bring forward as well. If you really test the case, you are down 5 years at least. Before the highest court then decides that maybe you were right or wrong. So I think it's more the reputational weapon that we should use, and tell them that if you do that again, then okay. And I think what we haven't mentioned enough yet is the clawback features, okay? I think we should use that much more and insist that proper clawback features are not only there for longer term rewards, but also for short term. In the financial industry, where markets are volatile, you have these huge variations from one to the other, and too often, particularly leading to the 2008 problems, we had getting big bonuses for the guys in 1 year, and the next year when they lost, they said, oh, it's too bad, but nothing. So try and get it back.
just pick up on the second part of the question, which is around making the consultation process mandatory. I think it may work for, some organizations will have very clear major shareholders and some won't. So you can have a very fragmented shareholding base, and that becomes very difficult to decide, which you should engage with and which you shouldn't. Also, you may find that, obviously from month to month, the shareholding base will vary. So it's like, at what point do you fix it to say, okay, you're in, and you people, you're out because you're not a major shareholder. So I would tend to agree with what the other panelists have said, which is to engage on a voluntary basis, and if you don't like it, then vote with your vote, basically vote with no. But making it mandatory may not be helpful in that case.
We'll take the next question, gentleman over there.
Thank you. Jill Posters, Future Fund out of Australia. You mentioned a couple of times this concept of simplification. That's turning out to be quite the buzzword in the Australian context as well. And it's led to a number of REM structures that are actually less friendly to longer-term shareholders like ourselves. So maybe the question for Christian, how do you get to a simpler structure without it becoming more friendly to executive management at the end of the day?
Yeah, very good question, but hard to answer. What's been tried is to say, okay, we said in Germany, management board members get 5-year contracts as a rule, 3 years de minimis, but 5 years in a rule. And there's been the suggestion to say, okay, 40% you will get over the 5 years, and then you add up the numbers, and that is quite impressive for the guy who gets it all. You get so many millions fixed pay, and there's perhaps 40% of long-term based pay and 20% for intermediate satisfactory performance. I think this kind of approach can be tried, and maybe not too bad as a starter to set up the right partitions. Not easy to do, but I think give the executives the idea that they're there for the longer term and that they get pretty big heap of money over the time. If you just sort of negotiate the 1 year pay is not so impressive. So maybe that's a helpful thing, and if you do that and say, oh, these are the big numbers, then my little suggestion of doing away with more pension-related payments and other benefits in kind, all out of the way, so these people know what they're sort of working for, but it's not all these nice additions that matter and are also causing complications for people who have to deal with that.
We will never get this right. And so we could come back every year and have the same debate, and we'd probably be talking about slightly different metrics. And one of the problems is complexity has risen and risen and risen. And if you read through remuneration proposals, remuneration reports, it'll drive you scatty. So I think that's the drive for simplification, but there is no standard answer. So simplification to just TSR, then companies can do really well in a stock market boom. So it needs to be unique to the company. It needs to be thoughtfully put together. It needs to be understandable for the executives as well. They need to understand what they're being paid to do, what results they're being paid to achieve. So for me, that's simplification. If they understand what they're being paid to do, if we understand what they're being paid to do, and the results are largely predictable, then you've achieved simplification.
There's one last question and we're running out of time. Would you mind if I just take the question at the back? Sorry, Corinne.
Carry on after the question.
Yes.
Hello, Faith Ward from the Environment Agency Pension Fund and asset owner. This is a bit of a bombshell, so I'll just leave it to go in. But one of the criticisms is obviously the fund manager industry is obviously quite well remunerated in its own regard. To what degree have Euan and Christian, have you reflected in your own organisational structure some of the lessons learned from your own governance activities to ensure there's no criticism of hypocrisy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. and rightly so. I think we're always blamed, well, you demand full insight into everything, but for yourself you don't, and so on. So, okay, given that we clearly have ESG in my little shop, we have clearly ESG as not an overlay, but it's part of the whole equation. I think the performance is related to ESG because that's our investment approach. Could we also do more in terms of ESG factors, particularly human issues, which are so relevant in our business? Yes, we could. I fully agree, and sitting on the supervisory board on this lot, I'm trying, but so far haven't sort of made too much inroads because it's the performance. But the performance is strongly ESG related today, okay?
Sorry, Faith, there's a red light flashing here saying time's up. No, I think it is a really good point that you make, and it's not just executive pay, but there is a focus on executive pay. It needs to be revenue margins, it needs to be operating margins, need to be seen to be sustainable. So that to me is the definition of ESG. If you make your business sustainable by looking to the long term, then you're probably pretty close to the right answer. And I think that is being taken increasingly seriously in our organisation, and that is reflected in not just the policy but the outcome of executive remuneration. I'll refer you to our 2 recent annual reports.
Thank you. And perhaps one last comment from Corinne, and then we'll wrap.
Yes, I'll just refer you back to what I mentioned earlier on, which is the the 3 recommendations from the UNPRI on the integration of ESG issues into executive pay. As I said before, the UNPRI recommends that these should be certainly included in the companies that you're investing in. My personal view is we need to implement them throughout the investment chain.
Thank you. I'm not going to spend time summing up. We've run out of time, but I think if we could say a huge thank you to all 3 panellists for this morning's discussion.